The cedar locomotive was small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Otis Warren had spent 3 evenings making it, not because it was complicated, but because he wanted the wheels to turn. He sat at his workbench in the back of the barn on a Thursday night in late October, the wood shavings curling onto the concrete floor around his boots, a single overhead bulb throwing amber light across the grain of the cedar. He did not hurry. A man who has worked with his hands for 44 years understands that the thing you are making knows when you are rushing it. When it was finished, he held it up and turned it slowly in the light. The wood was warm and smooth and carried the particular smell of cedar that, once you know it, you never mistake for anything else. The next morning, before the boy was awake, he walked across the wet grass between the barn and the cottage next door and left it on the bottom porch step. Remember that, because everything that is about to happen grows from that small wooden train on a wet porch step, and what follows is what it cost to keep it. That was 2 years ago. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, and it arrived the way all truly damaging things arrive, without drama, without warning, in a plain envelope delivered by a man who did not know what he was carrying. Nate Reynolds was standing at the kitchen counter in his slate gray thermal and work jeans when he opened it. Toby was at the table behind him eating cereal, still in his dark red knit sweater from the night before, his light brown hair pushed flat on one side from sleep. The cottage smelled of instant coffee and damp wood, and the rain was doing what Seattle rain does in November, not falling so much as simply existing, a gray, unhurried presence against the windows. Nate read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. Pierce Developments, in partnership with the Seattle Municipal Port Authority, had completed the formal acquisition of the industrial block on which the cottage and the barn currently stood. Under the terms of the acquisition, all existing residential and commercial occupants were required to vacate within 90 days. The letter was signed by the managing director. Her name was Evelyn Pierce. Below her signature, the ink was still sharp and precise, the letters of her name carrying the specific confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether the signature was the right thing to put on a document. Nate set the letter down on the counter. He did not make a sound. Behind him, Toby spooned up the last of his cereal and carried the bowl to the sink without being asked. The block where the cottage and the barn sat had been many things over the years: a working yard, a salvage lot, a forgotten corner of the waterfront that the city had largely stopped noticing. Otis Warren had occupied the barn for 44 years, running his millwork shop out of its timber frame interior since before the block had any particular value to anyone. The cottage next door had been a storage annex once. Nate had rented it 18 months ago for an amount of money that was just barely possible on the wages the timber yard paid him. Just barely possible was the only category of expense he could consider. 2 years before that, his wife Sarah had died. The illness had taken 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and in those 14 months it had also taken the house, the savings, and the independent building company Nate had spent 9 years constructing. He had sold the company's equipment to pay the last of the hospital bills, and the developers who had once hired him for major structural contracts had quietly stopped calling. Men who owe money to the wrong institutions find that their phone gets lighter without anyone ever explaining why. He had moved himself and Toby into the cottage in January. That was the month he found the first cedar locomotive on the porch step. Stay with me, because this is where the world as Nate Reynolds knew it stops spinning for the second time. He did not tell Toby about the letter that morning. He folded it back into the envelope, tucked it into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket, and drove his son to school. On the way, Toby looked out the window at the wet street and said, without any particular context, that Otis had promised to show him how to cut a dovetail joint on Saturday. Nate kept his eyes on the road. That's good, he said. He said it takes practice, Toby said. He said the first 10 are just for learning. He's right, Nate said. He watched his son walk through the school doors, and then he sat in the parked truck for 4 minutes with both hands on the wheel before he pulled out into the street. The timber yard where Nate worked the night shift occupied a flat, exposed stretch of waterfront that caught every variation of Pacific Northwest weather without apology. His shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. His job was loading raw logs moved by crane from the yard to the dock, from the dock to the barges, in a sequence that required precision and physical endurance in roughly equal measure. He was good at it. He had the kind of body that night shift loading produces over time. The lean, functional strength of someone who does not live to perform it, but because the work requires it. His direct supervisor at the yard was a man named Ed Cross, who was fair in the specific way that working supervisors are fair when they have done the same job themselves, without sentiment, without speeches, but with the practical decency of someone who understands what the work costs a person. When Nate had first started, Ed had simply handed him the safety briefing, shown him the log rotation sequence, and said, "You look like you know how to work. So work." That had been the entirety of their onboarding conversation, and it had suited Nate perfectly. That evening, after Toby was asleep, Nate sat at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of him and his coffee going cold beside it. The overhead light in the cottage kitchen was the kind that illuminates without warming, a flat, practical brightness that showed the chipped edge of the counter and the crayon drawing Toby had taped to the refrigerator door. The drawing was of two figures standing in front of a building that was recognizably a barn, though the barn in the drawing had a significantly larger door than the real one and what appeared to be a sun the size of the building itself in the upper right corner. Nate looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked back at the letter. 90 days was not nothing, but 90 days was also not enough. Not with a child welfare evaluation still outstanding. Not with a blacklisting that made it nearly impossible to secure independent contracts, and not with a rental market in Seattle that had moved in a direction his wages could not follow. The cottage was not much, but it was the only address Toby had known since his mother died, and addresses matter to child welfare evaluators in ways that are difficult to argue against. He refolded the letter, pushed it to the edge of the table, picked up his coffee, and drank the last of it cold. Across the wet grass, through the gap in the fence he and Otis had stopped pretending to repair, a single light burned in the back of the barn. It was past 10. Otis kept hours that followed no pattern Nate had been able to identify, except that the man appeared to be most alive between dusk and midnight, when the barn was quiet and the wood behaved itself, and there was no one asking anything of anyone. Nate looked at that light for a while. Then he put his jacket on, crossed the wet grass, and knocked twice on the barn door. Wait for it, because what the old man was about to say in the next 3 minutes was going to be the first thing in 18 months that Nate Reynolds had not already thought of himself. Otis opened the door in his mustard yellow flannel, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a short pencil tucked behind one ear. He looked at Nate's face. He stepped back from the door without a word and gestured toward the two wooden stools beside the long central workbench. He did not ask what was wrong. He had been alive long enough to understand that a man who knocks on a door at 10 at night already knows what is wrong. What he needs is somewhere to sit while he works out what to do about it. Nate sat. He took the letter from his jacket and set it on the workbench between them. Otis picked it up. He read it slowly, the way he did everything, with the unhurried, complete attention of a man who has never once believed that speed improved the quality of a thing. He set it down. He looked at the far wall of the barn for a moment, where 40 years of finished and unfinished work leaned against the timber frame in the particular organized disorder of a working shop. Then he reached across the workbench and picked up a piece of cedar no bigger than his palm. He turned it over once in his broad, warm hands, and he began to work. Nate came home from the timber yard at 6:14 in the morning with the cold of the waterfront still in his bones. The kind of cold that does not leave when you step indoors. It simply relocates, settling into the joints and the back of the neck and staying there until sleep drives it out. He pulled off his boots at the cottage door and left them on the mat, their steel toes dark with moisture from the dock planking. He hung his canvas jacket on the hook by the door. Underneath it, his slate-gray thermal was damp at the collar and the wrists. He checked on Toby first. The boy was still asleep, one arm thrown across the pillow, his light brown hair spread out in the particular chaos of a child who had moved through several complete adventures in the night. Nate stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not go in. He pulled the door back to where it had been and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water standing at the counter. He lay down on his bed at 6:20. He did not sleep until close to 8. The cottage was drafty in the particular way of old structures that have had their heating systems patched rather than replaced. Warm in one corner, cold across the floor, the difference between the two zones shifting depending on which direction the wind was pressing against the walls. He lay on top of the covers in his thermal and jeans with one arm across his eyes and listened to the building settle around him and eventually, without ceremony, went under. When he surfaced again, it was 10 past 11, and the cottage was quiet in a specific way that told him Toby was not in it. He found his boots, crossed the wet grass in his thermal, and stopped at the barn door. It was open by a foot. Through the gap came warmth and the smell of cedar and pine shavings and the particular dry mineral smell of old timber that has been worked and reworked over decades until the wood and the air of the space have reached an agreement. He did not push the door further. He simply stood in the gap and looked in. Otis was at the long central workbench, standing behind Toby with the unhurried, load-bearing patience of a man who has taught things to people for a very long time and has stopped confusing patience with passivity. Toby stood on a low wooden step block that brought him level with the work surface, his small hands wrapped around the body of a traditional hand plane, both palms flat against the warm maple of its body. Otis's broad hands were positioned just outside the boy's, not gripping, not correcting, simply present. A frame around the smaller hands, available if needed and otherwise staying out of the way. The piece of pine on the bench was clamped at both ends. Toby drew the plane forward in a single slow stroke, and a thin curl of pine lifted off the board. Pale and almost translucent, it turned once in the warm air above the workbench before settling on the shaving pile below. Toby looked at it. Then he reset the plane at the heel of the board without being told and drew it forward again. Another curl. He watched it fall. Otis said nothing. He adjusted the angle of the boy's left wrist by a fraction, just the lightest contact, one finger and a thumb, a correction measured in millimeters, and then withdrew his hand and let the boy continue. Nate stood in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame and both hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and watched his son make thin curls of pine lift off a board in a warm barn on a Tuesday morning. He did not move. He did not announce himself. He stayed where he was for a long time in the particular stillness of a man who has not had very much to be still about recently and is not yet sure what to do with the sensation. The overhead bulbs in the barn threw amber light across the workbench. The silver-white stubble on Otis's jaw caught the light when he turned to check the angle of the plane. His mustard-yellow flannel was rolled to the elbows, the worn cotton of the underlayer visible at the collar. He looked exactly like what he was, a man entirely at home inside his own work, inside his own building, inside the life he had built and maintained and defended simply by showing up to it for 44 years. The third curl of pine lifted off the board. Toby watched it fall. Then he looked up at Otis. Otis nodded once. Toby reset the plane and went again. Nate pushed off the doorframe and walked back across the wet grass to the cottage. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with the crayon drawing of the barn on the refrigerator door in his line of sight and drank it while it was still hot for once. Outside, the rain had paused. The wet gravel in the yard caught what pale light the November clouds were willing to release, and for a short time the block looked almost generous. He had 3 hours before the afternoon shift preparation began. He spent the first of them sleeping in the chair at the kitchen table with his coffee mug still in his hand. If this story means something to you, take a second to subscribe and join our community. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where this is traveling today. Now, we leave the quiet of the waterfront. In the 34th floor offices of Pierce Developments, in a glass and concrete building on 2nd Avenue that looked out over Elliott Bay, Evelyn Pierce sat at a desk that was large, pale, and almost entirely clear. The desk was not clear because she had little to do. It was clear because she preferred to work with one document at a time and to finish it completely before the next one arrived. Her father had worked this way. She had absorbed the practice without being taught it, the way children absorb the habits of parents who are more present in their method than in their conversation. The office was climate-controlled to the precise temperature she had settled on 7 years ago and never revisited. The lighting was indirect and consistent. The view of the bay through the floor-to-ceiling glass was significant and largely ignored. She had arranged her workspace so that the window was behind her, which meant she faced the room rather than the water. Her father had faced the water. She had decided early in her tenure that this was a form of sentiment she could not afford. Her dark hair was let out in its precise, shoulder-length bob, moving with its particular geometric exactness when she turned her head. Her forest green trench coat hung on the stand by the office door. Underneath it, she wore cream tailoring with the contained, functional elegance of someone who dresses for precision rather than impression. Her forest green manicure was immaculate, and her fingers rested with a faint habitual tap against the casing of the company tablet as she navigated the file her legal team had prepared for the block acquisition. The acquisition itself was straightforward. The block had been undervalued by the municipal assessment. The purchase had been executed cleanly, and the development timeline was realistic. There were 2 occupants requiring formal notice, a residential tenant in the cottage and a commercial occupant in the barn, and the 90-day notice had been served to both. The legal team had flagged no complications. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. Thoroughness was the specific discipline her father had instilled by example rather than instruction, a man who reviewed every file personally and never delegated the reading. It was the habit of reading everything personally that brought her to the archived folder at the bottom of the legal team's due diligence package. It was labeled simply with her father's name and a date range, 40 to 43 years prior. The legal team had included it as standard background. Historic ownership record. She opened it without particular expectation. Her father had been a methodical man, and in the early years of the company, before the company was a company, when it was simply a young carpenter with a single truck and a rented lot, he had kept a private journal, handwritten at the time, digitized by the family archivist after his death. Her legal team had pulled the relevant entries for the block acquisition file as a matter of routine. She began reading. The first several entries were logistical. Material costs. Site conditions. Her father's handwriting, even in digitized form, was tight and precise and slightly forward-leaning. Then she reached the winter entry. Pay close attention to what happens next, because it changes everything you think you know about Evelyn Pierce. Her father had been 26 years old. It was January. He had been contracted to lay the primary load-bearing framework for a 2-story commercial structure on the waterfront block, his first contract of any real size. The kind of job that determined whether a young builder had a future or a cautionary story to tell. He had made a miscalculation in the beam spacing of the eastern frame. Not catastrophic, not immediately visible, but structurally significant enough that, if built upon, the framework would have failed within 2 years under commercial load. It would have ended his career before it had properly started. He had found the error at 10 at night in the middle of a hard freeze. An older builder had been working a neighboring lot. He saw the young man's face in the site lighting and came over without being asked. He read the plans. He looked at the frame. He said nothing for a long time. Then he removed his coat, rolled his sleeves, and spent the next 14 hours in the freezing dark correcting every affected joint by hand, cutting, repositioning, and securing the beam connections with the precise, unhurried competence of someone for whom this kind of work was simply what work looked like. When it was finished, her father had tried to pay him. The older builder refused. He looked at the young man in the gray early morning light and said, "Don't thank me. Just pass it on when the winter gets cold for someone else." He walked back to his own lot. Her father never saw him again. Evelyn read the entry to its end. Then she read it again from the top. The faint habitual tapping of her forest green fingernails against the tablet casing had stopped completely. Her hand rested flat and still against the device. On the screen, the cursor sat motionless inside the archived text, the name of the neighboring lot visible in the entry's closing line, the waterfront block on the edge of the yard, the same timber frame structure her legal team had flagged as a commercial occupancy requiring notice. The office held its climate-controlled silence around her. Outside the window behind her desk, the bay carried its gray November light without asking anything of anyone. Her hand stayed flat and still on the tablet. The Municipal Zoning Enforcement Office occupied the ground floor of a building on 4th Avenue that had been designed to communicate permanence and had achieved instead a specific variety of institutional gray that made everyone inside it feel slightly provisional. The waiting area had plastic chairs bolted to the wall in a row and a drop ceiling with fluorescent grid lighting that operated at the frequency of mild, continuous discouragement. The front desk was staffed by a woman who had developed the particular professional expression of someone who processes human difficulty as paperwork and has made her peace with it. Nate arrived at 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the appointment his legal aid coordinator had arranged. He had come straight from the yard. He had changed in the timber yard staff washroom. The canvas utility jacket left in the truck, replaced by a clean but worn charcoal jacket over a white dress shirt that he had pressed the night before the shift started, hanging it on the back of the bathroom door, so the steam from the shower could work on the collar. His brown hair was neat. The light stubble on his jaw was the stubble of a man who had shaved 2 days ago and had not had time to shave since, which in this particular office on this particular morning read as what it was: a man doing the maximum available to him with the hours he had. He had no childcare. He had called 3 numbers the evening before and reached none of them at an hour that could do him any good. Toby came with him. The boy sat beside his father in the plastic chairs with his dark red knit sweater tucked into his corduroy trousers and his light brown hair combed flat by a father's hand that morning. And in his lap, he held the cedar locomotive with both hands, his thumbs moving absently over the smooth grain of the wheels the way they always did when he was sitting still somewhere unfamiliar. He did not ask where they were or why. He looked at the dropped ceiling for a moment, then at the front desk, then at his father's profile. Then he went back to the locomotive. Nate sat with his hands on his knees and his back straight, and his face carrying the specific composure of a man who has decided, before walking through a door, exactly how much he is willing to show. At 9 o'clock they were shown through to the meeting room. It was a long, narrow room with the same fluorescent grid overhead and a wide table down its center that was, by some accident of municipal procurement, made of cedar. Old cedar, pale and worn smooth by decades of documents and forearms and the particular friction of institutional business conducted across a surface that had never been chosen for any reason except that it was available. For chairs on one side, 2 on the other, a water pitcher in the center that no one had filled. Nate took the far side, Toby beside him. The charcoal jacket sat correctly on his shoulders. He had the acquisition letter and the legal aid coordinator's summary in a plain manila folder in front of him, edges aligned. He set his hands flat on the table and waited. Evelyn Pierce entered at 3 minutes past 9. She came in ahead of 2 attorneys, both male, both carrying identical slim document cases, both operating in the particular professional register of people who are present to execute rather than decide. They arranged themselves in the chairs behind her with the quiet efficiency of furniture being placed. She wore the forest green trench coat over cream tailoring, its sharp lapels carrying the same unhurried authority they always did. Her dark hair moved with its precise geometric exactness as she surveyed the room, taking in the table, the water pitcher, the manila folder, the man in the charcoal jacket, and the boy in the dark red sweater in a single unbroken sweep. She set her document case on the table, unclipped it, and withdrew a single bound file, which she placed in front of her with the edges squared. She had not looked at the locomotive yet. Nate opened the meeting because his legal aid coordinator had told him to open it, to state his position, to be specific, and to be brief. He was all 3. He described the cottage tenancy, the duration, the outstanding child welfare evaluation, and the structural impossibility of relocating within 90 days without materially damaging his custody position. He spoke in the flat, precise register of someone who has organized his argument carefully and is delivering it without the luxury of emotion, because emotion is not something he can afford to spend in a room like this. He finished. He set his hands back on the table. Evelyn looked at him across the cedar surface. Her forest green fingernails rested against the edge of her document file. She did not tap them. She opened her mouth to respond. And Toby slid the locomotive onto the table. He did it the way children do things that come from a completely sincere place, without announcement, without strategy, simply because it seemed to him like a useful thing to offer. He pushed it forward from the edge of the table to the center, between his father and the woman across from them, as if he were introducing 2 people who had not yet met. He looked at Evelyn with his large blue eyes and said, in the tone of a child presenting something he is genuinely proud of, "Otis made it." Evelyn looked down at the locomotive. Now this is where the story turns from a tragedy into something else entirely. The cedar locomotive sat in the center of the worn cedar table. It was small enough to fit in a coat pocket, and smooth in the specific way that only hand tools produce, a smoothness that comes not from sanding, but from the patient removal of material by a blade guided by a hand that has done this 10,000 times. The wheels were carved separately and pinned through the axle so that they turned. Evelyn could see this because one of the wheels was moving slightly from the momentum of Toby's push, turning in a slow, diminishing rotation on the pale cedar surface of the table. She looked at the locomotive for a long time. Her father's journal entry had described the older builder's work in the specific language of a young man trying to record a technical event but unable to keep the human scale of it out of his writing. He had described the man's hands. He had described the way the man worked alone in the freezing dark without asking for anything. No acknowledgement, no record, no return. He had described, with the slightly formal prose of someone writing in a private document they did not expect anyone to read, the quality of the finished joints. And he had described, in the entry's closing paragraph, the small object the older builder had been carrying in his coat pocket when he arrived. A hand-carved cedar locomotive, smooth-wheeled, no bigger than a fist, which he had set on the site materials box while he worked and retrieved when he left, without explanation. The same signature cut on the wheel housings. The same pinned axle. The same specific smoothness. 40 years between them, and the hands that made them had been the same hands. And now you understand why this story began where it began. The two attorneys on Evelyn's side of the table were looking at their documents. They were not in the room in any way that mattered. Nate was watching Evelyn's face with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read institutional expressions for information they do not intend to give. Toby was watching the locomotive's wheel finish its slow rotation and come to rest. Evelyn looked up from the table. She looked at Nate's face, at the charcoal jacket and the white shirt and the light stubble, and the specific expression of a man holding himself together in a room that has all the power and none of the context. She looked at the boy in the dark red sweater whose thumbs had left small, warm impressions in the cedar of the locomotive from a year of carrying it. She looked back at the locomotive. Her father had spent 40 years building an empire on a foundation he had not poured alone. He had never spoken of it. Not to her, not to anyone she had ever spoken to about him. She did not know whether this was modesty or oversight or the specific silence of a man who carries a debt he cannot calculate. What she knew, sitting in this fluorescent room with the worn cedar table between her and the evidence of a kindness that had outlasted everyone who witnessed it, was that the debt had not expired. It had simply been waiting for the winter to get cold for someone else. She set her pen down on the table. She turned to the senior attorney on her left and said, in the same unhurried, clinical tone she used for every instruction she had ever given in a professional context, "Withdraw the development petitions for the block. Both occupancies. File the withdrawal with the municipal office before the end of the day." The attorney looked at her. "Both," she said. He wrote something on his document. He did not ask again. Evelyn reached back into her document case. She withdrew a second bound file, thinner than the first, and set it on the cedar table. She slid it across to Nate. A slow, deliberate movement, the file traveling the full width of the worn cedar surface until it came to rest in front of his hands. It was an independent contractor agreement. Historic structural restoration. The waterfront block and 3 adjacent heritage properties already under Pierce Development's portfolio. A 5-year term. A master builder's rate. The kind of contract that does not ask a man to start over, but instead asks him to begin from where he actually is. Nate did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment with his hands still flat on the table on either side of it. Then he looked at Toby. Toby was not looking at either of them. He was looking at the locomotive in the center of the table, its wheel now completely still, its pale cedar surface catching the flat fluorescent light the way good would always catch his light, not reflecting it back cleanly, but holding it, absorbing it, giving it somewhere to rest. The locomotive sat between them on the cedar table. Neither of them touched it. Stay with me just a moment longer. Because the quietest victories never make any noise at all. There was no announcement. No ceremony. No moment where the city paused to acknowledge what had happened in that fluorescent room on 4th Avenue. Evelyn Pierce's attorneys filed the withdrawal paperwork before 4 o'clock that afternoon, and the municipal system absorbed it the way municipal systems absorb everything, efficiently, without comment, and without any particular awareness of what the document meant to the two people whose address it was protecting. The acquisition file was closed. The block remained what it had always been. An old barn on the waterfront. A drafty cottage next door. A wet gravel yard between them that caught the rain and held it in shallow pools that reflected whatever sky was overhead. Nate drove home from 4th Avenue with Toby in the passenger seat and the contractor agreement in its bound file on the back seat, and the locomotive in Toby's lap. He did not speak for most of the drive. Toby did not ask him to. The boy sat with the cedar wheels turning slowly under his thumbs and watched the Seattle streets move past the window with the quiet, patient attention of a child who has learned that the important things tend to arrive without fanfare and that the correct response to them is simply to be present when they do. When they got home, Nate parked the truck and sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he got out, walked around to Toby's side, opened the door, and held out his hand. Toby took it. They walked across the wet gravel together in the gray afternoon light, and Nate did not let go until they reached the cottage door. By Thursday, the storm had moved through. It left behind the specific quality of air that follows a long Pacific Northwest blow, clean and cold, and carrying the faint salt of the sound, a transparency to the light that made the waterfront look briefly like a place that had been newly made. The Puget Sound lay silver and flat under a pale autumn sky, the kind of sky that offers no warmth but a great deal of clarity. The cedar and alder on the far bank caught what light there was and held it in their upper branches, gold and orange, and the particular dark green of conifers that do not negotiate with seasons. The barn doors were open. Otis was at the long central workbench with a folded cloth, working linseed oil into a plank of old-growth fir with the slow, circular motion of a man who has done this specific task so many times that his hands know the pressure required without being told. The oil darkened the grain as it went in, pulling the wood's color up from inside it, the amber deepening in long stripes that followed the growth rings laid down 100 years before anyone in this story was born. The barn smelled the way it always smelled, cedar and linseed and old timber, and the faint mineral cold of the concrete floor, and the pale afternoon light came through the high transom windows and long, low bars that crossed the workbench and the floor and the stacked lumber along the walls. Nate stood near the tool bench on the opposite side, a dry cloth in one hand and his old engineering calipers in the other. He was cleaning them, working the cloth into the joint of the jaw, removing the accumulated grime of months of disuse, the chrome coming back under the cloth in small brightening increments. His canvas jacket hung on the wall peg. His thermal sleeves were pushed to the elbows. The light stubble on his jaw had grown 2 days further since Thursday, and he had not thought once about it. His posture was loose in a way it had not been for a very long time. The shoulders dropped, the back without its load, the specific physical release of a man who has set down a weight he had been carrying so consistently he had stopped registering it as a weight and had simply accepted it as the shape of himself. He was not that shape anymore. Toby sat on the low step block at the near end of the workbench. He set the cedar locomotive down on the clean workbench slats in front of him, pushed it forward a short distance, and watched the wheels turn. Then he pulled it back and did it again. He was not playing. He was simply occupying himself in the unhurried way of a child who is entirely comfortable in a place and has nothing to prove about it. The three of them were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when the silence between them requires no management. Outside, the pale light moved across the gravel yard. There is a thing that happens with quiet acts of goodness that the people who perform them rarely live to see. It does not announce itself. It does not keep records or send notices or arrive at a predictable time. It simply persists, moving forward through the years in the dark, the way a root moves through cold ground, following no path that was laid out for it, finding its way through the resistance of ordinary time until it arrives somewhere that no one expected it to go. A man spends 14 hours in the freezing dark fixing a young carpenter's mistake, asks for nothing, and walks away. He does not know that the young carpenter will spend the next 40 years building a company on that corrected foundation. He does not know that the company will pass to a daughter who will inherit not only the buildings but the habits of mind, the thoroughness, the personal reading of every file, that will one day lead her to the page where his name should have been written and was not. He does not know that the locomotive in his coat pocket that night will be copied by a 70-year-old man in a barn 4 decades later and left on a porch step for a boy who needed something smooth and hold a hold. He does not know any of this, because quiet acts of goodness are not performed in the knowledge of their destination. They are performed in the dark, in the cold, on the available evidence that the person in front of you needs something done. That is the whole of it. That has always been the whole of it. The debt does not expire. It does not diminish. It moves forward through the years looking for the moment it is needed, and when that moment arrives it walks into a room, wearing a worn charcoal jacket or a mustard yellow flannel or the small warm hands of a 7-year-old boy, and it does what it was always going to do. It pays what it was always going to pay. Not in cash, not in ceremony, in the specific, ordinary currency of a life made possible that would otherwise have been unmade. Pass it on when the winter gets cold for someone else. If this story brought you a moment of truth, take a second to share it with one specific person today. Not a group, not a feed. One person, the mentor in your life. The quiet one who shows up without being asked, who keeps the lights on for everyone else when the weather turns and never mentions the cost of doing it. Send it to them. Let them know that someone in this world saw what they were carrying and did not look away. In the barn, Otis finished the last long stroke of oil on the fir plank and set the cloth down. Nate ran the dry cloth one final time along the jaw of the calipers and held them up briefly in the low light, checking the surface, then set them down on the bench beside him. Toby reached forward and pushed the locomotive one more time along the worn oak surface of the workbench, and the pale afternoon light came through the transom windows at its long November angle and lay across the cedar body of the small train and across the turning wheels and across the smooth, warm grain of the wood that two pairs of hands, separated by 40 years and everything that 40 years contains, had shaped into something that would outlast them both. The locomotive rolled to a gentle stop on the workbench between the two men. The light rested on it,